Hey, everybody, you're listening to and watching the Comic Book Bears podcast. I'm Bill Zanowitz,
I'm Brian Pittard.
I'm Steve Morey.
And I'm Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
and we are your hairy, heavy homos that talk about comics, but you don't have to be a hairy, heavy homo to listen in, or in this case, stream in. And we're going to dedicate the entire episode to DC Comics. If you've been following the news, DC, the publishing wing, and also the DC Universe streaming service were hit by massive layoffs this week. Some have been calling it the DC bloodbath. And with all the negative things that are connected with words like bloodbath and implosion, and we'll get into implosion and what that means specifically for that company with its history, we decided we're going to be a bit more positive about that particular publisher. There's plenty of books over time that we have loved from DC Comics to, in my case, they're like pretty obvious here. This week I had my fill of the armchair quarterbacks who seem to know the ins and outs of corporate politics better than Business Insider, and I hit a breaking point this week with that kind of nonsense, and I'm tired of seeing these insensitive posts where real people's lives are affected. And as I said, these are massive layoffs. It's almost everybody at DC Universe. It's 1/3 of the editorial staff from DC Comics itself. And when you do go in with this criticism that doesn't provide any sensitivity to that aspect, it boils my blood. And on top of that, I've really felt that a lot of those attacks were attacks on the company itself. And you have to give DC and Marvel a lot of credit for hanging in there. Marvel through its bankruptcy, DC through other issues that have happened over its history. And there's a reason why these two publishers are still here and why we're not talking about Charlton Comics or Gold Key Comics or Harvey. There's a reason these characters and these particular publishers have stuck around. I know sometimes I tend to be like a positive Polly, and I'm not a glass half empty person to begin with, but I have my breaking point. So we're giving you something else. We're going to give you what's great about DC Comics. Let's just go around the horn there. I think most of us have something DC on. Why don't we start with Brian, because I think you're the exception.
Yeah, I completely spaced on the theme that we were addressing. And anyway, I may have to do a costume change in the middle of the show. I know I've got DC somewhere. But yeah, this is my. So yeah, if you see me disappear, that's why. No, this is my Provincetown Lego lobster shirt, and I love it. And I just realized there's an oil stain that's down below you can't see, so I'm sad. But hey, it doesn't matter. It looks great. Plus, I'm wearing my knit cap because my hair is a wreck. So, completes the look.
All right. Let's go down to Caleb. Caleb, what are you wearing?
So my T-shirt game was weak. Because it was weak, I had very good intentions of coming home and going up to my attic and taking out my husband's Aquaman costume from Halloween. But I got home super late. It's been a long day, so I didn't have a chance to. But I did grab, and I think I've worn this before. It's a Batman shirt. Depicting some very cool art. It's an import. It's from Japan. I got it in San Francisco at a comic book shop. I forget which one, but it was one of them in San Francisco. Fell in love with it, so I had to have it. And it is one of two DC comic book shirts that I own. Because again, my T-shirt game is weak.
Over to Steve. Steve, what do you got?
Well, this one, I don't know if I've worn this before while streaming, so but this is actually a shirt that I love that our own Brian Pittard actually got for me several years ago, and it somehow still fits. But it is not an official DC shirt, but of course it's got Batman versus Superman as bears pounding it out with full beards and bellies and muscles. So it looks good.
All right. For my shirt, this shirt is, oh boy, 2011. I didn't think this shirt was that old. I didn't think I was wearing a 9-year-old shirt, but it's a Free Comic Book Day shirt, as you can see there. And this was the year that the official shirt was from Darwin Cook, using DC Comics characters. And you can see all over. My favorite is the three flashes, denoting a speed reader. Of course, Batman, saying this isn't a library. You can't not be a dick. Uh, and I did have a moment with one MegaCon where I was waiting for a cab, and Darwin Cook was across the way waiting for a cab, and he pointed at my shirt, and it was just a sweet little moment, especially given the circumstances that followed. So that's what we're wearing. Now, I mentioned the news. Steve, you're usually pretty good at encapsulating what happened. So why don't you talk about the layoffs and the developments at DC Comics?
I hate doing this, but when it comes to unfortunate news, but one of the big things that happens quarterly with and annually with a lot of big media companies is they have their big financial and I forget the name of it, and obviously Bill, you probably know that. It's basically a presentation to all their shareholders and to anybody who's obviously with the financial media, who's interested, what their earnings have been, what their plans are for the upcoming year, and of course, any kind of response to changes in the market that require them to restructure or do whatever. And Warner Media actually, of course, had theirs, and Time Warner had theirs. And one of the big things from that was the announcement that they were eliminating a large number of positions within the Warner Media groups, including DC Comics and DC Universe. They also, for other people, things that we've talked about before, HBO Max also saw some layoffs. HBO saw some layoffs, and a couple other their studio groups as well. So, but not to the extent it seems as DC has. I think, Bill, you counted it out, about a third of their editorial staff were those positions were eliminated or combined,
and also very top heavy.
Yes,
layoffs.
It was definitely a lot of the senior staff, not seniors in age, but seniors in their executive status. Same thing with DC Universe, except it was, I think, a lot more far reaching. I think a lot more of a cross section of pretty much everybody there, regardless of seniority. Now, this did, of course, restructure. They changed around who the publisher was at DC Comics, as well as the YA and children's publisher. They have those two positions are separate now. And of course, there was some speculation about Jim Lee because, it's like, well, where's Jim in all this? He's still there as co-publisher and chief creative officer.
He's not publisher. He's still there as chief creative officer. And Marie Javins and the other woman whose name I can't remember, at least for now, are reporting to him.
Yes.
So he's still in that COO position.
Javins?
Yeah, Marie Javins is the publisher. She is the DC Comics publisher.
The situation is they are actually looking for a publisher from eGames, from the eGames world, if people read that. And initially when I saw that news, I was like, oh, that's ridiculous. But then I also think of probably the best outside publisher DC ever had was Jeanette Kahn. So maybe somebody coming from the outside is not the worst idea up at top.
Interestingly enough, though, it's getting to be a much smaller field if you're trying to hire outside, because Warner Brothers, of course, also has their games division, their electronic games division, and video games, and all that. But yeah, it was not pretty at all, and of course, a lot of it has been mostly rumor, conjecture, sort of just a listing of possible names and people who have been reduced. But I think it was yesterday, the actual email did go out to all the people within AT&T Time Warner, but then specifically also for DC. So the people whose positions are being eliminated will be working with DC continuing through, I believe, November, sometime in November, but then their position has gone away. So it gives them some time to look for something else. But this is, for anybody out there who's watching or listening, this is not the best environment to go looking for a job, especially in media, in publishing. It's very difficult. But
So, with what you were saying about the letters going out saying you're with us until a certain date, is that true across the board?
It's basically true across the board because of the California laws
Okay.
that when you do have a massive layoff or
90 days, isn't it?
or factory shutdowns, that you do have to give 90-day notices. So
Okay.
since all of DC Comics publishing is basically in Burbank at this point, that's the deal.
Well,
Yeah.
and I hope so, because that buffer's needed. We have a mutual friend through 11 O'Clock Comics, whose spouse, and I'm not going to name names because it's not my business to tell. Their spouse worked for the DC Collectibles department.
We forgot to mention that, yeah.
And that's why I was asking. And this individual had actually taken off to celebrate their 1-year anniversary, and got the call that the division had been dissolved. And so I didn't know, and the way it was put to her and the way it filtered down to me through the mutual channels that we have was that it was just done and over with. So I hope for her sake and for their sake that that 90-day buffer and that work is there for them to give them a little bit more time. But I just wondered if that was true for the collectibles department.
Yeah, it does look like all indications from what's been reported is that DC Direct has been eliminated.
Yeah.
It was DC Direct and DC Collectibles, and now DC Direct again.
Right.
But also there is this atmosphere right now, which is I'm sure what AT&T was looking at, where they do have contracts with McFarlane Toys, they do have contracts with NECA, they do have contracts with Sideshow, and there you may see some more outsourcing. But then again, at this point in the game, I don't think the high ticket toy collectible market is really booming at this point. So there may be activity there that doesn't kick up again until a later point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we're hoping that some of it's like cyclical, but I think, like you said, Caleb, the idea is that it's a done deal. Between now and November, there is, I think, what the implication is that these jobs are not coming back anytime soon. So they are gone and done as of November. That's not to say that in the future something might change, that they might bring a division back. They might recreate or reassemble a division from the past. But it's very difficult to say. And Bill, you had implied that DC has been, as you
cough and die.
Please don't. But that DC is no stranger to this, and Marvel either. I mean, Marvel has been here, DC has been here before. Both of those, yeah. Wear your mask, people. I don't have mine up here.
Sorry about that, folks.
But I mean, both of the big two houses have been through here before. Somehow, sometimes it's been even worse, like more doom and gloom announcement rather than just layoffs. But I mean, it's not good to hear, especially as a fan of comics in general, but especially a fan of comics, of DC Comics and DC Comics properties.
I would like to cut in right now, since you mentioned it about the publishers having hard times. There is a book put out by Tomorrow's, and I'm just going to make sure that I don't cover my face like I did last week. It's called Comic Book Implosion, which is co-written by my friend Keith Dallas, and it goes into a very painstaking detail the situation that existed in the summer of 1978, where DC had this massive expansion of titles called the DC Explosion, and then when the sales figures came in from the previous months. Again, this was a very different time. I mean, Brian, you were alive, but I don't think you were reading comics. Steve, you weren't alive yet. Caleb, you weren't alive yet. I was there as a very cheerful and excited 11-year-old, and as a reader, it was really like getting the rug pulled out from under you, because you're expecting all these amazing things, these new titles, and they were having these reprint titles of stories that were just inaccessible to you because of there really wasn't a definitive back issue market then, and DC had retracted to 20 monthly titles at the end of it, with three dollar comics, which were the giant size ones. That's all DC was publishing for at least 11 months. And again, the Comic Book Implosion goes through the backstory, and what I was saying, I think I just skipped over this, because you didn't have the immediacy of, I don't know what the comic book equivalent is. I know in music it's SoundScan, where you basically know your figures, contemporaneously with the purchase. They had to wait for months for what sales figures were. And the winter of 77 into 78, there were massive blizzards. So in a lot of ways, like the pandemic right now, there's this situation that is affecting. It's not the sole reason why there are these movements in corporate America, but it definitely is a factor. And if you want a history lesson and just some amazing stories, I mean, there's a book they talk about that they were going to have called The Black Bomber. Your mouth will fall open, like whoever thought this was going to be a good book. I'll just leave that story, but it's good.
Well, it's funny you should talk about that. Timura's put out the history of this. As a kid, reading through back issues and finding stuff in quarter bins and things like that referred to or talked about all of these titles and everything that's happening in DC, and then also finding stuff in like 1980 dates that are like, we're back, like, where'd they go, what happened between 78 and 79, like, I don't know. And it's sort of like this interesting thing that not having been there and not having seen what was happening, obviously 20-30 years down the line, 40 years down the line, you're like, it probably wasn't that bad. I'm sure it was awful for people who were working in the industry at that point.
Oh, yeah.
Also people who were big fans, who didn't have the vast choice that we have today about all, looking at every comic that comes out on a monthly basis or a weekly basis.
There is one amazing development that came out of the implosion. One amazing development. At the time of, I'm trying to think of the dates. The Superman film was originally set for Christmas of 77. And then they pushed it back to Christmas of 78. And with the tie-ins that would have been with that the release of that film, there was going to be a 3-issue arc and showcase of World of Krypton. Since the film got delayed, World of Krypton's showcase issues got delayed. And then when Superman came out and they were releasing stuff again, and they had these issues that were already in the can, that was DC's first miniseries. And then Marvel had not had a miniseries either. And it sold incredibly well, because I think there is that attraction of look, it's only 3 issues. I can stick with it that long. And, that changed the industry in a lot of ways. Just think of so many of your favorite stories that are born out of miniseries. Just think of it. That's a massive change. And that was a result of the implosion. So it wasn't all bad what happened. I think that the necessity of a business move like that and the risk that they did take, because there's no issue 4, no matter how much you want it, no matter how much, how well 1 through 3 sales, it was a big change.
Well, and I think that's something to important. That's important.
It's a shakeup. No. It's okay, Caleb. Go
Oh, I
ahead.
was just going to say that's important to kind of talk about the fact that change it's not necessarily bad in the long run. Sometimes it leads to good things, and I think that can also be true of this moment. And that's not to take away from the sadness and the very real hardship that people are going through now that they've been laid off and that their jobs are gone. Like that part, there's nothing for as far as anything good happening. It's just terrible. But on some level, I think this is a little bit of DC as a publisher, as a comics organization, kind of seeing a lot of writing on the wall in that the direct market in and of itself is at this point it's limiting exposure. I mean, look at what they're going. Look at their YA line and how good it's doing everywhere else. And so I do think that they're gearing like they are gearing towards that because they have to change. And when I say they have to change, I don't mean because anything's not working for them. Bill, you mentioned AT&T as an umbrella company a while ago. And since 2017, AT&T has laid off 41,000 people. Since the end of 2017. And so this isn't a thing that's happening. These layoffs is not a thing that's happening because DC is a bad publisher or they're putting out bad books or bad stories. It has literally nothing to do with the quality or really even the money that DC is bringing in, because if you follow up the layoffs, if you follow up the trail, it goes through Warner Media and it goes all the way up to AT&T. I mean, to literally people that just assume that DC is an IP factory on a spreadsheet that's a percentage of their gross net. Those people don't care how well it does. They care more of what it produces. And so there are a lot of people, and I know this is one of the aspects of just the internet being the internet, and people speculating on, oh, well, this is because of this, obviously. And it's like, no, it literally has nothing. And I'm not a DC guy, so I'm not somebody who has a reason to like stand for DC. I just like comics, but it has nothing to do with the content or the elements. It literally goes up to just being blips on a spreadsheet and to being owned by a mega conglomerate that again saw fit to, I'm trying to think of the politically correct way to say this, saw fit to get rid of 41,000 jobs while also giving multi-million-dollar bonuses and applying for tax cuts across the board every year. So, and I think that's like you just have to throw that in there because there are a lot of people who do, and that's the boring part. No, that's the not fun part, is following the numbers and the money. But it literally has nothing to do with any of the drama that goes on, like that we're seeing fall out of this and the speculation, which is just childish and dumb.
It's not romantic. It's not a way of looking at it in a way that allows so much personal importance or creative importance on what's being put out. It is at heart a numbers game that has absolutely nothing to do with what they're doing, but just that, hey, we got to cut some jobs here and there. We got to trim some expenditures somewhere, make this balance sheet look a little bit different. And it just so happens to be several hundred people or a couple thousand people.
There's nothing romantic about unfettered capitalism.
No.
But
it's also, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, the benefit of this could be comics that get out of the direct market and are no longer sequestered in the four walls of the direct market. Speaking metaphorically, and kids start reading DC comics, and DC comics get put into a place that with the YA graphic novels and stuff that will pick up in places that those kids aren't going into comic shops. They're just not.
It's also worth noting,
picking it up
from a business perspective, that when AT&T bought Warner Brothers, they also did acquire Warner's massive debt. Yeah. So that is also a factor in this. There were going to be separations no matter what when this acquisition took place. So I hate being an adult.
It's the worst.
It sucks.
Less interesting.
It really sucks, doesn't it?
It's stupid.
It's stupid. You're so stupid. Is there anything from the people that are streaming in, Brian? Do we have any comments or?
A couple related to this.
Yeah.
James is saying, it's capitalism running a rampant.
Yeah.
That's what we said.
Watch it run.
Yeah, no, I asked in the chat what our favorite DC books are. So when we get to that, we can throw those in there as well.
Okay, great. All right. So you mentioned favorite DC books, and again, that's the purpose of this particular show, talking about the things we like. Steve, you're always my lucky charm, so you're going to start with you. You're going to start with you. We're going to start with you, and why don't you tell us about something that you've chosen that you recommend to the world?
Well, so one of the things that we were talking about earlier this week when we were figuring out the theme for this episode was, stories with DC, like completed runs or like
Yeah.
big storylines that just really spoke to us, that we loved. And for me, I started reading comics as a kid, around like 89, 90. And of course, when I was starting with comics, what did I gravitate towards? I gravitated towards the ones that everybody knows: the X-Men, the Spider-Man, X-Men, the different Spider-Man books, the Superman books. Not so much Batman, but is in there. So like all the big name titles that you see, and of course, being a kid, not having a lot of money all the time and constant access to a comic book shop or to to a local 7-Eleven or anything that sold comics constantly and regularly enough that I had complete runs of stuff. I didn't really find massive storylines that really spoke to me. Just these comics are cool, these characters are cool, just kind of pulling anything I could find. It wasn't until a little bit later when I was a teenager and starting to get a little bit blah with superhero comics. I had discovered other DC titles by that time, and I had, really enjoyed heavier fare like the Spectre and, some more of the horror comics and things like that had, a lot less to do with tights and more to do with, the darker side of human nature. And I discovered the Sandman. I knew nothing about Sandman. I was pulled by one of Dave McKean's really fantastic, very cool, surrealist covers for issue, I believe it was issue 54 of 53 or 54 of the Sandman title. And it just so happened to be right towards the beginning or middle of the World's End storyline, where if anybody's familiar with the Sandman, most of the books that people are aware of are like these very set storylines that build the Sandman universe. And they go, everybody knows you start right here with Preludes and Nocturnes. And then, a lot of people's favorite is either Seasons of Mist or The Doll's House. I personally absolutely adore the Kindly Ones. I think it's one of the most fantastic stories of the Sandman universe and also of all time. But for me, The World's End actually has a lot more of a sentimental feeling and value because it was the first Sandman story that I read. And it's also the first Neil Gaiman I ever read. And that particular issue was basically, it was about the, and I'm trying to think of that, the Necropolis Letharge, which was basically this, giant city of the dead where everybody who lives there is in the mortuary arts, and they talk about death all the time, and all they do is they bury people or serve funeral services. And the great thing about World's End is that it shows off Neil Gaiman's writing ability magically, because it's story about story about story about telling a story. So there's so many layers of different stories. The characters themselves are part of the story, and in the story they tell a story, and those people that they talk about telling the story tell stories as well. And I immediately fell in love with it, and I grabbed all the issues that I could, going back to the beginning of The World's End, which starts with issue number 51 and goes through issue number 56. So it's not a big storyline. It's not a lot of issues. It's easy and pretty quick to read, but they're so dense. They're so packed with these just beautiful characters that some you may recognize if you've read a lot of Sandman. Some characters that pop up like Hop Gadling or Clurcan, the fairy. But you don't have to. You can just picture these as just random story characters that they themselves are telling stories, and you understand them because Neil Gaiman's an amazing author. The great thing also about this book is that it has so many different artists specifically. And Sandman works, Neil Gaiman has worked with great artists throughout the run of Sandman. And usually what they do is they take an entire storyline and they're sort of like, that's the visual language that you associate with that particular story. In World's End, it's a different artist, sometimes multiple artists per story, per issue. And you get great ones. You've got obviously Brian Talbot and Mark Buckingham are doing the sort of the bookends for every issue, but you've got Alex Stoyans, John Watkiss, Michael Zulli, Dick Giordano, Michael Allred actually has a really great story in here. He does the art for Prez, sort of like a retelling of Prez in the most fantastic way possible. And I had never heard of Prez before, but I read this and I was like, I know Prez now. And I went back and I read other Prez books, but it was like this, it's the essence of who Prez is. And so if you're a fan of DC or have never known anything about DC, here's something that's a deep cut in DC lore, getting an amazing Neil Gaiman treatment. You've also got Vince Locke is in there. Tony Harris has a few pages here and there. Like, it's funny, like some of these big names of the early 90s and the 80s have like a few pages. Like they got a couple pages that they could do stuff with. But it of course is out. It's been collected like all the Sandman books. If you have the individuals or if you have the the giant omnibus or definitive Sandman, if you don't, you can buy it as a separate book. This is my hardcover version, but it's just amazing. So here's Mike Allred doing his Prez. You've got some other beautiful iconic imagery as well that people may have recognized from Sandman t-shirts or whatever. There you go, with death there. It's a beautiful story, and the characters are fun. Even though they only last for about 20 pages, you love them. You fall in love with who these characters are because Neil Gaiman's voice is so perfectly apt to just bringing out what it means to be a storyteller and projecting what it means to be able to put your whole soul into a story, even a small 20-page story or 5-page story, depending on who's telling what. But anyway, this book and this storyline actually made me fall in love with Sandman, made me fall in love with Vertigo, and with more adult comics. Mm-hmm. And it's all due to DC, and this is something that wasn't put out by anybody else, could not have been put out by anybody else at the time. And of course, it's very influential for millions of writers and creators and readers and blah, 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 blah from then on. But anyway, Sandman World's End, that's one thing I want to recommend.
Yeah. If you can believe this, I was really late to the Sandman game. The single issues, the first few issues came out when I was at my last semester of undergrad, and people were still friends to this day. Rob Stager and Sharon Galbraith were imploring me, you have to read Sandman. You have to read Sandman. And I was really busy because it was my last semester and wanted to make sure I graduated in time, so I didn't. And also I had this preconception that it was going to be very much like Hellblazer. And I didn't really cotton to Hellblazer early on. And I think I'm justified in that. I think once you get to the Dangerous Habits arc, that's when Constantine really gels. But I was really late to the game, but I echo almost everything you say, Steve. And when you say like it could only be done with this publisher, some of the best moments in Sandman is when he does play with DC continuity and these weird corners within it. Not just what he did with the characters that were just basically hosts of the mystery comics, but with Cain and Abel and Destiny, just flushing them out as full characters. But when you have appearances like Fury and Hector Hall, and particularly Element Girl with that harrowing story about her history, and Prez,
and that's just one issue, and Prez is one issue.
Yeah, plus, as you mentioned, the artists that are involved within Sandman, some of the most beautiful art you will ever see in your life is from the Ramadan story with Pete Craig Russell. Oh
Yeah.
my God, so beautiful. And, even my favorite Matt Wagner, has a really powerful story in there. And uh, sometimes with the list of artists that you have mentioned, these aren't necessarily artists that you would put together on the same
Mhm.
project from an editorial sense, but Gaiman is so crafty in his storytelling that it all works.
Yeah.
And I do think Sandman is required reading if you are a comic fan. May not be the best entry point. May not,
Yeah.
I would say that it might scare the hell out of you at the beginning, but I do think if you are dedicated to this art form, at some point you have to read it. And also, a lot of props to Neil Gaiman and DC for providing that template of having a series that lasts as long as it should last.
Mhm.
Uh, 80 issues is an arc that was followed by Starman, by Why the Last Man, by countless other long form series. Um, of course, there's like ancillary stuff, and
Yeah.
the dreaming itself is given birth to a lot of wonderful stuff.
Yeah.
But I do echo a lot of your praise for that. Anyone else, Sandmanny? Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm also I was late to the game, which for me, Sandman was kind of it was new a few years before I really got into reading comics. So I like it, 90s book, big goth 90s thing, but it just wasn't. I missed it by like that much. But you're talking about artists and amazing artists that came from there. It's the first place I really saw Colleen Duran
Hmm.
show up and fell in love, and she's only in there for like one or two issues. It's not much, but I
Hmm.
remember like seeing those one or two issues and just being like, this is different than the stuff I like. This isn't Sam Keith. This isn't any of these other gorgeous things that we've seen, but there's something special about this, and it was Colleen Duran,
Yeah.
who really named it home. But everything that Steve talked about, you can only echo it because it's number one, Steve's poignant, but it's so true. Like it's so very true. But it's always struck me, and Bill, you just said this, that Sandman is one of those series that when you talk about, oh, this is the first thing I would recommend to people who want to read comics but never have. People always mention Sandman. I'm just like, no, 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 no,
No.
no, 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 no.
No.
Let that one sit on the back burner for a little bit. It's
Yeah.
way too dense. It's like you need to have a handle of the medium to really appreciate. You can read it, sure, but you need to have a handle on the medium to really be able to appreciate the work that it's doing.
Yeah.
And most of that is true for anything that Karen Berger edited.
And
Because
still does to this day.
because she's just a font of amazingness.
Hmm.
Um, eh, yeah, and like as we were picking out our favorite books of DC, I've got a stack over here. But if you had to said the favorite things about DC, I think Karen Berger has to be on that list
Hmm.
because she's, she's literally Wonder Woman of the comics community. I mean, she's an Amazon of sequential art. And
Yeah.
we owe so much. DC owes so much of its genetics of at least in the past 30 years. It owes so much to what Karen Berger brought.
Yeah.
And that's through Sandman,
Mhm.
specifically.
Yeah. And if you think she can't dip her toes into superheroics, keep in mind she was the editor through the best period of the Legion of Superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Always keep that in mind too. She's very good at editing superhero titles as well. I'm glad her trajectory went the way it did, because I don't think there's any other editor that would have provided the sensibility that certainly had an audience that needed to be catered to. Well, let's say like there was no such thing as a Vertigo audience before
Right.
Karen Berger, yeah, and somehow it got cultivated through the high quality books that were coming out. Brian, anything you want to add on that?
I mean, you guys have covered it. My favorite story from Sandman is the one-shot special that did the story of Orpheus. That one, for whatever various reasons in my life, really resonated. And I had been reading, Sandman, not in the floppies. I think it was several years after in the trades. And I actually, it's just off camera,
Yeah.
but I have my absolute, hardcovers that we've lugged out before, and yeah, they're amazing tomes. I should get them out off the shelf more often and manhandle them and read them again. But yeah, no, it's great stuff. And I don't. So the thing is, like Caleb was saying, it's not good starter comics, and I kind of agree with that. But I think if you go through the collection and somebody says, read this story, I think there's a lot of good anthology like moments, like we've talked about, that are great little nuggets that anybody, whatever their sequential art perspective, will enjoy. But I agree with Caleb. It's the more you know of the medium, the deeper appreciation you'll have for the craft.
Well, and kind of what I wanted to to agree both with Caleb and Brian on this one is that if you tried to give Sandman issue number 1 to somebody who doesn't really know much about comics, doesn't really read a lot about comics, and say, here, read this, they're going to look at you like you're nuts. But with something like World's End, because it is an anthology piece, it doesn't specifically, in fact, there are very few stories in here that specifically mention Sandman or even have him in it at all. But it's more about the medium of storytelling, and I think is a great introduction to the idea of what you can do with sequential art and how you can tell stories, illustrated stories, in a way that is more complex than I think a lot of people give the medium credit for. And they do it in a way where they're almost timeless, because especially in World's End, the stories take place either in completely different worlds or in the past. So you have Jim's, the tale of the cabin boy, Jim's story, which is one of my favorite Sandman stories ever, told from the perspective of the cabin boy on a early 1900s sailing vessel that involves an immortal Hobgadling, who, if you've been reading Sandman all this time, you've been introduced to him. You know him. He's a character that's well liked and shows up a lot in his, previous books. But here, he's a side character. He's a character in a story being told about somebody, about their life. And it's like, this interesting person I met on a boat who happened to be really fancy and rich and own the boat. And oh, by the way, it seems that he's very old. But it's just it's just really interesting and amazing. And I think, being able to recommend this World's End as a good introduction to Sandman, or just introduction to Vertigo books, or introduction to more mature titles, could work. And then hopefully somebody would be inspired by this, like I was, to either continue reading Sandman and go back all the way to the beginning, start over, and then come back up to this point, rereading the stories, getting to see some of the characters and say, oh, I recognize them. That's how they got to that point, or whatever. And it's pretty neat.
Okay, we got to stop because we're just going to keep talking about Sandman all night. One really quick thing I want to mention that I think has to be mentioned with Sandman, and that is Dave McCain's amazing covers. I think that has to be mentioned anytime you talk about Sandman. Let's go over to Brian. Brian, tell us about a book that you would recommend.
Well, let me real quick, since we've got some comments related to this here. James, of course, the Necropolis story is fantastic. I never knew about open air funerals until I read that.
That's where I learned it.
Shocked to know it was a real thing. And then he also added Petrifax.
Yeah.
I actually got a limited series a couple years later. Yeah. Steve's absolutely right. His characters show up for 20 pages and you love them. We also have Kristen. Ramadan is incredible.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's issue number 50. If 50, you just want that one. Issue number 50.
James as well. Gaiman has said Sandman is a story about stories, of course. And then our very own Caleb, who likes to chat, which is great because otherwise it's just me impersonating our whole show on this. Yeah, Sam Keith and Dave McKean. No, that's not right.
Dave McKean, yeah.
Dave McKean. I'm thinking of the actor from Clue and many other shows. Oh man,
Mark McKean. No. McKean. I know who you're talking about.
Mr. White in Clue,
or Mr. Green.
Mr. Green. Anyway, I can't. My brain's not working. Anyway,
Final Tap and from blah blah blah. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm gonna go Grant Morrison because that is like my favorite writer in many of the things we've talked about over the years here, of course. And several of us here as well obviously love Grant. I'm gonna pick Final Crisis, and I don't have a hard copy. I actually was looking back on my shelf like, don't I own that? And I did at one point. I had the issues. I think I still kept them, but I have to dig them out. But I'm intending to get that absolute edition at some point. But I have a couple screens that I want to share because when I revisited Final Crisis very recently, there were a few realizations that I had. So I'm gonna take the magic of screen sharing here. Let me pull up one of these pictures. Yes, do the sound effects. The sound effects help.
Ah,
So I love this shot. So if you haven't heard of Final Crisis is a DC event, a crisis, which usually is a big, epic, bring all the toys out kind of story with universe shaking ramifications, right? But this page particularly, I think this is from issue 2, or no, I think it's like 3. Um, as we are going back into the workforce when potentially it's not the most safe, and as we are being how cavalier with our elders and everybody else, like no, you need to be productive. The economy is what's more important right now. I saw this page and almost did like a spit take. Basically, Darkseid has taken over in Final Crisis. He kind of takes over with this anti-life equation, and is like telling everyone, to work for Darkseid, live for Darkseid, to die on the job is to die for Darkseid. And I was like, oh my god, seriously, Morrison. Like, and it's a timeless, like, it's not a new idea, but like, I just love the synchronicity of this. And then, of course, work, consume, die, judge others, condemn the different, exploit the weak. It's like he was channeling Trump. I mean, it's kind of amazing. And then there's one other shot. I don't know if it'll let me switch to it. I'm going to real quick pull up the other one. Show and tell here. It's being slow. I'm going to hold off on that one. So, Final Crisis is an interesting series because it's sort of, at the time, it was considered the zenith of a lot of things that Grant Morrison had been doing in DC Comics. And of course, after that, he ended his run, his amazing run on Batman, and sort of wound down over time with Batman Incorporated and then this and that. And the return of Bruce Wayne, of course, it came in after this. But overall, he kind of had stepped away then from DC until he did Multiversity, which is another book I was going to talk about, but it's a lot to talk about. But this really is his magnum opus, and it ties a lot of things together, including the Batman story arc, culminating in, I think it's the penultimate issue with the death of Batman. Of course, it's never that complicated, or it's never that simple, and things happen in comics. But the other picture I wanted to share from this issue. So the whole thing with this issue is it's about New Gods and the death of the New Gods. And it all kind of centers around this murder mystery of somebody killing the new god Orion. And even though there was this really interesting Death of the New God series that Jim Starlin wrote prior to this, that was sort of an editorial like, oh, we need to get here. But Grant wasn't necessarily always dialed into that, I think. And so he kind of just did his own version of this. But the idea is the New Gods were reaching the end of their era, and he had this thing he had been playing with in Seven Soldiers where Mr. Miracle, for example, was sort of reincarnated in this new body and this new personality of Shiloh Norman. And what I do enjoy about this issue is that he pays that off. He brings that back. He gets to tie in with this character. I think I picked this page because one of the problems with this, and this is the Mr. Miracle character here who's being shot. One of the problems with this book was in the production itself. It was J.G. Jones, I believe, who did a lot of the art, the first, a little more than the first half of the series. Some of the work was a little rushed and or didn't quite make it in time, and they ended up having to switch out to Doug Mankey later on.
Yeah, and also there's points where it's obvious it's not just Jones drawing to make deadline. There were some points where it's kind of obvious.
I think in issue
it's a shame because his work in this is really good.
Oh yeah.
No, the time, but
the beginning of the series is very strong art. It then starts to get diluted and mixed in. It's very much a jam piece. Mm-hmm. I think I picked this page because though, Shiloh Norman's a black man, And I don't know if it's an editorial note, a colorist confusion. I'm really kind of trying to, I need to dig deeper to figure out what happened here. But in this, they kind of make Shiloh Norman, they kind of whitewash him. Or he's just very light skinned. I mean, that's also possible. But in the other incarnation in Seven Soldiers, he's a little darker. So I was kind of confused by that. But I do love this down here. Dark Side, as everybody knows, of course, is this evil, most evil, like probably one of the baddest badasses or villains of the DC universe, and he reincarnates in this issue within the body of a very well-known Superman side character. I forgot his first name, Turpin, Detective Turpin.
Yeah, Detective Turpin.
And
Terrible Turpin. Yeah.
Terrible Turpin, right.
Yeah.
And it's a really heartbreaking choice to use him as this reincarnation because, I mean, they kill the guy. I mean, they basically take him over. But also, that's someone very dear to Superman. And as I was going back and sort of reflecting on this issue, the ties to the Superman mythos are very strong, and the ties to the Green Lantern mythos are very well developed. And that's funny because then later on, Grant Morrison would come back and he's been doing this interesting and kind of groundbreaking in some ways Green Lantern series about Hal Jordan. But obviously Superman, who he then eventually did later write in New 52 with Action Comics, like these are all characters. Oh, and then All-Star Superman, of course, which is actually another really good choice for best DC book. But be that as it may, Grant loves these characters. He's talked quite a lot in his comics and his interviews and in the book Super Gods about his love for the idea of superheroes and what it means to him and sort of the metatextual sort of ideas that he explores. And he does some of that here in this book as well. So all of this into a fairly action-packed and dark and bleak at some points DC event book. It's very unlike anything I've seen since, except for, I would say, Metal. Because as I'm reading this again, I'm like, oh my God, Scott Snyder, and I knew at the time, like Scott Snyder kind of was borrowing and sort of referencing ideas from Multiversity, at least from what I remembered. But there's a lot of the DNA of Final Crisis in Metal. The villains all get this amazing offer of superpowers if they will, sign up with the bad guy. The universe, and this is an archetype. The universe is about to end. All of this is that. But I was definitely kind of getting that spirit, thinking back on Metal from this. As we talked about the art, we talked about the storyline. By the end, I don't know that the ending is successful. In some ways, I think the last issue is very dense and yet weirdly sparse because a lot of the action, it's not like it's off the page, but it's hard to follow. I mean, there's a lot of things sort of like, I remember reading Grant Morrison talking about this. The world is collapsing in sort of a singularity of evil. And the stuff that happens with Batman and Darkseid and the Batman pulling a fancy sort of New Gods gun on Darkseid and Darkseid giving Batman the final sanction. Like all of this stuff is pretty heady concepts, even if it's dressed up in very simple superheroics. But that time compression and the way it sort of ties into the multiverse and the monitors, which is a big part of this series. It's a lot of DNA again from previous crises and previous DC continuities of mostly Jack Kirby, with the New Gods. But it's dense, and I don't know that it entirely works because when Morrison is really dense and amazing, it can work and it can be amazing. He's done a lot of that. But in this issue and this last issue, the way it lands, I think in some ways Multiversity needed to exist to sort of let him really finish the story better and stick a landing, because I remember Multiversity having a lot more. But Bill, what did you think?
Well, with Final Crisis, I love the ridiculousness of it. With all the heavy stuff going on, still my favorite moment is Mr. Talkie Tawny, the talking tiger from the Shazam world, ready with the proper fisticuffs to take on Calabac.
Yep.
That's something I think there are other writers that could pull off, but I don't think they could pull it off as well as Morrison did. I enjoy some of Morrison's justifications because when there is a chaotic event that happens, Tawny bites, yeah. When there is when there is a chaotic event that happens in real people's lives, a lot of it isn't linear. It's your mind is not working in that particular fashion. You're addressing one thing as it comes. So it did capture that sense, but I also felt that there's a lot of major developments in Final Crisis that are off panel.
Yes.
And particularly, we should have said, and I'm not spoiling anything. What is this book, like 12 years old at this point? There's a development from Apocalypse that affects Earth, and we should have seen those after effects. Yeah, there were tie-in issues, but we should have seen the immediate impact, because first of all, it would have been a hell of a story, and second, it was an absence, I think, that was definitely felt.
The
And there's so many
Superman Beyond, those
Yeah.
2 issues to me, I mean, Superman just disappears for like 2 or 3 issues. They completely take him off page, but he's having adventures in the multiverse that are amazing, by the way, and in 3D at the time. With Doug Mankey, actually, I think that's partly why he was brought in, is because he did those issues with Morrison. But then also the Legion, the 3, was it Legion of 3 Worlds or whatever?
Legion of 3 Worlds, yeah.
Like that also was another, departure. And I think Jeff Johns, I know he was involved.
Jeff Johns and initially George Perez, but again, nothing could have been more delayed than the Final Crisis books.
Yeah, oh my gosh.
And also, with the end of Final Crisis, again, not to spoil, but Superman basically defeats Darkseid with harmony.
Yep.
But not everybody gets that from the way it's presented. So it is flawed, I think, from a conventional storytelling standpoint, but I do think that there's so many gems among it that it's definitely a worthy read. And again, with what you had mentioned with Shiloh Norman, and he's obviously white there, but then you also have Aquaman, who's been dead, it just appears out of nowhere.
Yeah. What?
I just interpret it as ripples of the time stream. The one element that came out of this was never followed up on was the new versions of the Forever People and whatever the Fifth World was supposed to be. I really wish we got that story at some point.
So that's the thing. Morrison, I think, had these great ideas that he was seeding, but he knew that he wouldn't necessarily be the ones to follow on with them. So, he puts all this out there into ether. And yeah, in some ways, I'm glad Scott Snyder did pick up some of this and is, carrying it forward, even if I don't necessarily love all of the results. But yeah, that's a thing you do. And then, Bendis has done this. A lot of writers, they'll seed things in case they want to pull them up later, or other writers will take them. But in this case, yeah, they didn't follow through on the Fifth World at all. Which could have really been cool, because it ultimately redesigned the New Gods in the way that he did Shiloh, and he did, which made a traditionally white character African American, which would have been really cool. In fact, again, some of my favorite parts of Seven Soldiers is the Mr. Miracle stuff. But yeah, no, they just left it all there, and I guess at some point they could still follow up, but it's so convoluted now with everything that's happened.
Yeah. Do you feel any input on Final Crisis from the other two fellows here?
I mean, for me, Final Crisis, because I didn't read it at the time that it was going on, so there's a lot of the build up, a lot of the lead up to the event that I didn't get. So I didn't have that. I hadn't read those books. So just looking at Final Crisis itself and the series itself, there's a lot in there, especially in the first issue when, they're revealing sort of all the incarnations, like the human incarnations that were actually, the New Gods or the Apocalyptans and all that stuff sort of, coming out. A lot of that was confusing to me. And obviously there's a lot of stuff. It's Morrison, so there's always going to be potential for some kind of crazy, wacky shit that's going to happen, or that he's going to, like Brian mentioned, like plant a seed there and then hopefully grab it up later to kind of explain it, which a lot of times, especially for Final Crisis, at least in the main book, and he could have explained it in other books or some of the, some of the tie-in issues. But I agree that Multiversity, where he was given all the time in the world, essentially, to create what he wanted and to say what he wanted to say, I think was a good way for him to kind of take a lot of these ideas and expand on them, expand on the ones that he felt like he needed to expand on, and then just give us something a little bit more in a very weird style where he was basically given freedom to do whatever the fuck he cared to do. That was still canon, and that would still be something that people later on could refer back to at any point and pull up, which they did with the source wall and all this stuff that he kind of threw at the wall in Final Crisis, and then again in Multiversity, people were playing with, like Green Lantern, and just it's kind of cool. I think he, like most of those DC events, like you get these breadcrumbs, you get these ideas that people might not touch for about 5-10 years, but when they do, you can be like, hey, I remember that from that one thing.
Steve, talking to your point though about Morrison and some of the ideas and things that he played with. I mean, this splash page, which is from the side book, this amazing splash page by Doug Mahnke was in the Superman Beyond book.
Yeah,
but it gets to the bleed. Yeah, it gets to a critical moment critical moment in comics. Yeah. Lois Lane is dying. Superman is there heartbroken and dying because of a dark side related, attack.
Yeah. I forgot. And only being kept alive by him with his heat vision.
That's right. Yeah. Thank you. So he has to be there. But this like monitor vampire character, we're not even going to get into. It's so convoluted.
Murdoch. What was his name?
Well, she's somebody else, but she's related to the it's a whole thing. Yeah. But at the time you think, okay, she's trying. So she's recruiting Superman because she needs help. And Morrison is depicting the multiverse when Superman is kind of going out and going into the space, this yellow submarine, basically, into the multiverse, into the bleed. And the way they do the panels depiction is a key Morrison concept of these parallel realities all being depicted as comic book panels. Like that is a key idea for Morrison, that comics, by their very nature, even within a book, can be like this universe that's a parallel world to our own. And it's some heady, fascinating stuff that I love. Anytime it gets brought out, and Morrison is typically the one to do that, although I know the writers have, obviously done this too. It's fantastic. And this is the side book. So, I mean, there's a lot.
I also love when they do gather together the Superman analogs and you see Captain Atom there, and it is so clearly Dr. Manhattan just being called Captain Atom.
Well, and he follows up with that in Multiversity as well. So, like, again, Multiversity really is like that. I'm going to come back in and there's the Dr. Manhattan pastiche, Captain Marvel. But yeah, no, I mean, so anyway, long story short, Final Crisis is a remarkable book. Obviously, I would not ever recommend this as a first comic book. The Batman stuff alone, and it ties into like Kamandi and
Jonah Hex, doesn't it? Well, no, that's where he...
Not Jonah Hex, but
that's later in the when he's traveling through time. Yeah,
who's the caveman?
Anthro.
Okay, yeah,
and Vandal Savage.
Yeah, and Vandal Savage too. So it's universe spanning, but it's a love letter to DC.
Immortal Man too. Immortal Man. There's a big Immortal Man thing in there.
Brother Eye and the what was the Nomad or Omax?
Omac, yeah.
It is a just intense love letter to all of DC, which makes it also really special. Yeah.
Caleb, got anything?
Brian, you wanna be a lamb and get on the chat and display my shame for the world to see?
I wasn't sure if you wanted me to, but
no, go. Everything I put on there is free.
Okay, well, I think that's a good thing. Okay. I know that Final Crisis basically has this reputation as a failure, but if it's a failure like the Magnificent Ambersons is a failure, and it's a failure like Blade Runner is a failure. There's so much meat on the bone that. And I completely agree with you, Brian. You don't get to Final Crisis till you have a lot more under your belt, but the rewards are many. And I think you will especially enjoy it when you do get to it. You will see the faults, you will see the seams, you will see the cracks, you will see things that do not make sense. This was one thing that I also was a bit troubled, though, because Final Crisis was the first trade that did some doctoring from the remember from the initial issues. They did
Really?
some recoloring, which maybe what Shiloh is. They replaced some characters, so there are some subtle differences between, and that's something I don't advocate for. It's I don't know. I just think if it came out and there were warts and all, it should be collected warts and all. But I think you will get something out of it, and I think you've certainly read enough DC stuff in the past to ready yourself for it.
Well, it's on the list of things to read, and I just want to say the reason I haven't read it is not because of any of reputation or anybody saying things about it's a failure or anything like that. It's just because I was not a DC kid, and I did not like it. I just literally haven't gotten to it yet, and I honestly I came to DC late in life, or like, to the life I have now. I didn't start reading DC until probably 5 years ago. So like, and I've read a lot of DC in those short 5 years, but I just haven't gotten to the stuff. And it's something that I need to read. It's something I want to read. Because like you said, it's whether or not people like it or not, by reputation, it's a landmark. It is something, and this is part of DC, and for better or worse, this continuity, you can't understand the full scope and the full picture of DC unless you understand the connectivity of the multiversal universal continuity. And even then, I don't know that you can understand it, but you can at least make those, like, it leaves you little dots to connect. And Morrison's great at that, in everything that he does, whether it's stuff like multiversity or whether it's, the umpteen dozen things he's written that, don't seem like they would be high concept, because he does write low concept stuff from time to time with DC.
Yeah,
but it's low key high concept. It's never without its own brilliance.
Yeah.
And I'm not a Morrison guy, but he's fucking brilliant.
All right. Well, you sort of have the mic. Let's hear about a book that you dig.
So I want to. Speaking of Grant Morrison and brilliance, I want to preface this a little bit. I love Bill Zanowitz with all my heart, my whole heart, the whole thing. When
What's not to love?
When he sent a message to the group this week to some behind scenes, how the sausage made stuff, he sent a message to our group chat saying, "Hey, this is what our episode should be about this week. I've never hated you more in my life. You're making me pick my favorite DC thing. Like, this is it's
I didn't necessarily say my favorite DC thing. The only thing I wanted it to be like a complete arc,
right,
because my favorite DC story of all time is one issue of a Vertigo series, is Animal Man number 15. That's my favorite DC comic ever. Well, it's the most powerful DC comic. I probably have other favorites, but no, I wanted the arc. But I'm sorry that I did that to you. When we get to our woofs of the week, you're an asshole too. So we'll get to that.
You just proved my point, though. It's damn near impossible. You said you had your favorite comic, but maybe it's not your favorite because it might just be the most powerful. It's an impossible Herculean task. You did because you're saintly, give us the benefit of saying, "Hey, grab a couple." Gave me options, and options are great. So I decided to go with the book that. This book did not make me fall in love with DC. This book made me respect DC. This entire series, it made me realize, again, kind of like what we're talking about with the book that Brian just spoke about, the grandiosity, the depth, the scope of what DC has to offer. And I mean this, it made me respect DC. And that book, it took place over a year, and it came out every week, and it's 52. I love this book for the simple fact that when I started reading DC, when being a comics kid, I knew the Trinity, right? Like, I knew what DC was. I didn't know any of the less impactful characters. Maybe that's the wrong way to put it. I didn't know any of the characters that were really offshoots or characters that had amazing stories, but that weren't fan favorites. And a friend of mine, a guy that I now actually do a podcast with, I just met him at the time. Name is Craig. He's a wonderful man. He said, "Hey, you need to read 52. If you're looking for a way into DC, if you're looking for a story that, number one, explains kind of DC where it is, or it was then and kind of is now, but also that allows you to skirt around the Trinity, this is where you find it at. This is where you get that book at." And I found so many characters and so much story here that I fell in love with. And not even just characters and story, so many creators that I fell absolutely in love with, because it was a Herculean feat in and of itself. This book came out every week for a year. And it's made by amazing creators, you know, Grant Morrison, Jeff Johns, Greg Rucka, Mark Waid, Keith Giffen. It's got a smorgasbord of artists that I've come to love. And so no matter what kind of art you tend to lean towards comics, chances are you're going to find some of it in here. There's going to be something, it's going to treat you so many ways, you're bound to like one of them. But what this book did for me, as far as the DC universe goes, it opened up a door to these characters that are beloved by so many people, but don't get the fanfare. Characters like Batwoman, who the modern conception and incarnation of Batwoman was, I don't know that it was born out of this book, but it certainly hit its stride in this book. As far as her being a lesbian and her being, you know, just the Kate Kane as we know her today, those seeds are all here. The modern, kind of the modern inception of Booster Gold came out of this book. At least as I know him, you know, being the time traveling, you know, mishap that he is. Skeets, Skeets being one of my favorite characters in this whole thing. It really gave me a key to getting past the Trinity, getting past quote unquote superhero comics, and getting into the world behind the Justice League, if you will. This book made me not fall in love with, but at least fall in like with, and give some empathy to Ralph Dibny, which I'd never had before, and I'd read him in books before. Animal Man, you know, in this book has his own broad set of issues that he goes into, and so like this, like I said, it's a dense book. So much of this book is what they built the New 52 out of, which is unfortunate to say, because the New 52 necessarily wasn't. This book is way better than what came out of it, I think.
Yeah, I don't connect the two really.
It's a
It
transition.
this kind of felt like the last real gasp of greatness from the DC unit, the post-crisis universe.
Right.
But they were fucking stuff up after that. You know, the direct sequel countdown is a bore.
Hard.
Yeah.
And that's what's also so wonderful about this book, is because it's so much, there's so much more there that they could have done with, that they could have built the New 52 out of, and they didn't. I think they squandered that.
Yeah.
In so many ways. But this book, like in its own bubble, is truly brilliant. Somebody in the comments just mentioned the Everyman Project, and like the Steele's arc in this, the familial emotions of watching his niece make all these mistakes. Renee, I would be.
Oh, Renee, yeah.
Renee Montoya. Like, this book made me fall in love. Like, made me fall in love with The Question and Renee Montoya, and it's what led me to go back and to read all the other Question stuff that I've read since then. And The Questions are, you know, he's probably top 5, top 10 of my DC hierarchy and characters. And I'd never read anything about The Question prior to 52, and it's what made me want to go find that. It's a very dark book at times. Like, if you get into the Black Adam stuff, it's a very heavy book. It's both heavy and dense, but it's still got the hope that DC, to me, embodies and embellishes more so than any other shared universe that comics has ever had. It's not feel good, but the hope is still laced into everything, and it does all of that by taking the Trinity off the board. And granted, I didn't have a lot of experience with the DC universe prior to reading this, other than mainstream, the main of mainstream, mainline DC. But I would have argued, I would have bet you money and fought you in the street that you couldn't take the Trinity out of DC and do anything with it, that they were it. And this book proved me absolutely wrong. Everything about this book proved me wrong. And I'm way better for it. So, and honestly, like, we were talking about shoe-ins and places to put your foot in the door to get to the DC universe. I would give 52 to people. I don't think you have to read Infinite Crisis. It helps to understand 52, but you don't have to necessarily have read Infinite Crisis to read 52. I say that because I didn't read Infinite Crisis before 52, and still walked away with my jaw scraping the ground, because it was just so unlike anything that I'd ever read before. Just the teamwork that goes into making this book, and the camaraderie and the communication that allowed them to pull this off. Weekly series are not new. They aren't something that we are inexperienced with seeing, but they're rarely good.
Yes.
That's the key. This was good. They had it all worked out.
Yeah. I think the real hero of 52 is editor Steve Wacker, who, subsequent to this, got headhunted by Marvel, and now has a fairly high position in Disney Animation. That was a Herculean effort with 4 major heavyweight writers. And and I totally echo what you say about a lot of it, Caleb. The Black Adam stuff is some of my favorite stuff. I never thought that character could be that nuanced, and it followed up on the threads that Johnson started in JSA, and is really, to me, and it's funny because they don't look too dissimilar. To me, Black Adam is DC's Namor. That there isn't one easy position to judge the character on, and it's funny because they actually do look alike. I never thought about that before.
It's just the ears. Come on.
But no,
my only wish for myself with 52 was that when it was coming out, it was an effort, because of the job that I had, to read the book every week. And there were many weeks where that was the only comic book I read, just to get the weekly effort in. And I didn't really have fun reading it. And I'd like to reread it without that particular pressure I put on myself. I also know somebody that, again, with 52, everything takes place within a calendar week. And there was somebody I knew who, if the story took place on a Sunday, they would read the Sunday pages, and then they wouldn't read till the next day.
That's dedication.
That's dedication.
I don't have that, but that's dedication.
And in terms of the podcast world, one of the coolest pieces of dedication is Pants from the Comic Geek Speak podcast. I believe he has a page from every issue of 52.
Really?
An original art page from every issue. I believe so. I know he was collecting them. I'm not sure if that was his goal. That's how I seem to remember. I haven't listened to that show in ages. So,
also, well, I don't even think Pants is on that show anymore.
Yeah, no.
But one of the genuinely nicest human beings that you'll ever come into contact with, from what I understand and have gathered. Just a sweetheart.
Yeah. So, Brian, Steve, I just wanted to see if there was anything 52.
And you're talking about wanting to read it. The format, the 2-book format that this book comes out in now, that you can get in the omnibus form, they're $45 a piece, full price. You can get them at a heavy discount. You can get them for way less than that now. It's a great way to read it. You don't get like a lot of bigger books like this, folks are worried about getting losing stuff in the gutters. You don't get that in this. So if you want that, get the big books if you haven't read this.
I love this series. I think this was actually my return to DC, because I really can't remember much prior that I had been into And then I was getting back to comics at the time. I think I had been into a little bit more Marvel when I got back in, but this book of all of the other stuff, and
Mhm.
it set me up then for everything that followed. You know, all of the different
Mhm.
DC events and interesting series that came. I got into, and even stuff that they referenced in this, I went back and dug up and read more about. And yeah,
Mhm.
this was a great jumping off point.
I mean, I read some of 52. I didn't read all of it. Again, it was that Infinite Crisis, Final Crisis, 52 Countdown. All of that stuff was before I got back into comics, and well after I had kind of gotten out of superhero comics altogether. So, um, the big crossover that got me back into reading DC was Blackest Night and Brightest Day. So that's my era. Everything that came right before that, I missed out on.
Mhm.
Other than a few issues here and there that I've gone back and been able to read. But yeah, I mean, it sounds really good that you can get into large volumes, because if you're looking at value here, if people are still worried about value,
Yeah.
you can't go wrong with 52 20 some page issues.
Steve, I can also tell you, as somebody that kind of got mixed up in it, and I had to pull the brakes on myself. Of all the books that cater to the widescreen effect, if you read 52 through DC Universe on your TV, it's pretty awesome.
Hmm.
So that is one that if you want to go through the TV mode while it's still there, I
Yeah, it'll be
would
there. I hope.
definitely recommend that. Okay, boy, we're talking, and I guess this is going to be a 2-hour show, but we can go through our second choices really quickly.
Yeah, yeah. That,
But I do want to talk about this book because this is going to lead directly into Steve's second book, from what I understand. Um, and we've heard a lot tonight about books that brought you back. You know, Brian's mentioned it, Steve's mentioned it. For me, the book that brought me back was a miniseries by James Robinson and Paul Smith called The Golden Age, which was basically Elseworlds retelling, sequel sort of to the wartime stories and All Star Squadron, but it really was its own thing. Um, so that was the book that brought me back in trade form. So for a couple of years, I was just reading trades, uh, apart from Grant Morrison's JLA. I really wasn't buying too many comics, but when I got back in, those were the books that really registered with me. So um, from the Golden Age, I found out about the magic that was Starman. This is my favorite series of all time, DC or otherwise. And Starman tells the story of Jack Knight, who was the son of Ted Knight, who was the original Starman in the Justice Society of America. Uh, at a time, the 90s, that are not looked upon in retrospect as probably the most creatively beneficial um, periods for the comic book industry, just because of some of the gimmicks that were going on. Uh, this book was something else. This and Kingdom Come, I think, are just. It's great that we had those exceptions as the 90s was going on. But again, for some of this, for me, was in retrospect because it wasn't contemporaneous until later. Um, Jack Knight is um, an owner of a collectible store, which ties in a lot to his love for the past. You have a situation with his father where at the start of the series, there's a lot of loggerheads between the two of them, and what basically happens is Ted Knight's other son, David, initially had the mantle of the new Starman, and David split the scene really early. Let's just put it that way. And the cosmic rod, though, if you watch Stargirl, you'll see that this is a staff. Uh, Thanks to Jack's modifications, he takes over the identity of Starman. This is a very comic booky concept. But what is within, and again, we were saying this before, 80 issues, is a story of family, is a story of friendship, when you get to characters like the Odares and particularly the Shade. Um, like Sandman, there's a lot of interesting reinterpretations of characters that are in the side corners of the DC universe. There were there were Starmen, let's say, between Ted and Jack, and we get to see all of them. Um, so it starts with Sins of the Father, which basically um, reintroduces the main villain for the Knight family, which is the Mist family, and there's some really interesting stuff there, including rape and all my books are autographed by James Robinson and Tony Harris. Um, as you go into the series, the best stories are um, the ones that are called Talking With, where mostly with David, the other Knight brother, but some other characters as the timeline goes on, which are kind of breaks in the action. The other breaks in the action are stories called Times Past, and this is bearing me with this because it's it's fantastic. Where these are one-off stories. I think there may be one two-parter in there that tell stories of not just Ted or Jack, but other Starmen throughout time. And this one has a very important uh, quote for me from James Robinson that he wrote out. We are all of us in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars. It's not just a Pretenders lyric. So, and there's a lot of emotional attachment I have to this particular series because at the core of the series, for me, and I know there's other people that don't get this from the series, so I think it's just where your perspective is. Uh, it's the story of a son coming to love his father where he previously didn't.
Yep.
Whether there was some disturbances there. I didn't exactly have that relationship with my father. I was much closer with him through time. Um, but the story ends up with Sons of the Father, um, and uh, in January of 2000, my father lost his battle with leukemia, and this is where the end story, the end arc comes in. Grand Guignol, I can never pronounce that fucking word, and Sons of the Father come in, and where Jack was with his father was where I was with mine, and seeing that play out in the months ahead was an important bit of therapy for me, because both with my father and what we see played out in Starman is there was nothing left unsaid.
Yeah.
And I don't know how many people get that. I don't know how many people are granted that. And it was incredibly important therapy for me in dealing with what, of course, was a seismic development in my life, and definitely contributes to my to how I view this particular series and its impact on me. But I do think people will get an amazing experience when they do read Starman. So that's me.
I love that series. I never finished it, which is totally my own fault because I was
Yeah.
reading it in those smaller hardcovers that they put out.
Mhm.
But you know, it's one of those that I intend to finish. I may just buy them all in digital or whatever. But
Why don't you
God,
get
yes,
DC Universe?
is that still a thing?
Yeah.
No, I probably should honestly. It'd probably be cheaper, but
Yeah, honestly, what I think is going to
Yeah.
happen with DC Universe is I think it's going to morph into something more like Marvel Unlimited.
Yeah.
yes,
That there'll be like a limited video
Yeah.
content, but there'll be more emphasis on the reader aspect, because that's been doing well. I mean, at the height of the first weeks of the shutdown, that was responsible for 1 million reads a week.
my
So
goodness.
yeah.
Yeah.
But it's definitely a great series. A lot of it touches on a lot of history. I mean,
Mhm.
you've talked about it. It's great. It's a great book.
Yeah.
I think a lot of new readers wouldn't necessarily know what to make of it because it
Mhm.
does have a lot of
Mhm.
ties to history
Yeah,
throughout the.
but it's interesting because in a lot of ways, Steve, this is the world's end of Starman, the times
Mhm.
past. In a lot of
Uh,
ways. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I could
Yeah.
see that. Like Brian, I didn't get to read the entirety of the series. I was buying it in the not hardcover, but in the paperback trades before they started consolidating them and creating sort of like the larger volumes where they have, you know, like 2 or 3 storylines smushed together. But yeah, I mean, if you have a love of nostalgia for the golden age of DC, that's what this pulls that up into the modern era a lot, and it gives it a different perspective of seeing it. Like it's not as like goofy. It plays on that.
It plays on
makes fun of it a little bit, but you see
but also
prettiness.
through the story, Jack develops in a particular way where the nostalgia that was omnipresent in his life is replaced by something that is much more realistic. And I think that's a journey a lot of people should take. So it's interesting you said that, because I think that's also at its core of the love of legacy, but that you also have to love what's happening right now.
I would recommend this for somebody, especially now if they're big fans of Jeff Lemire's work with the Black Hammer universe. The entire Dr. Star series is, at least in my opinion, almost a little bit of a love letter to James Robinson's Starman, because it's a different perspective. Obviously, it's from the perspective of the father for the whole thing, but it really does refer to it so much, and you can see just kind of like little inspiring points, which obviously is what Lemire meant, you know, with something like this. But
another one of my favorite comics of all time, the Five Friends story about the death of Ragdoll. One of my and amazing artists throughout. I mean, it's mostly Tony Harris and it's mostly Peter Snegberg toward the end, but the fill-in artists will just knock your socks off. You know, whether it's Matt Smith or Phil Jimenez, Craig Hamilton, who does not do enough comic book work. Just some amazing artists in there in the ancillary stories.
James reminded me because I think I encountered this in the story. He gave us the gay Starman Michael, or however you say that.
I've always said Michael.
Which meant the world for early 20-something James, who was desperate for gay representation. Yeah, James Robinson absolutely gave some great representation early on. And what's cool is that character then comes back later, and his brief, but still pretty good Justice League work that James Robinson did. That's a great character reference.
Cool.
All right, Steve, what's your next book?
Well, coming right off of Starman, actually.
And unfortunately, we do have to speed this up a little bit. Because
so very, very quickly, I want to bring up something that did come out of the New 52 initiative. It was not a New 52 book, though, although it came out right after New 52 happened. So it's not technically New 52, but came out in November of that year, of 2011. The Shade, which specifically is about the Shade, Golden Age villain, and sort of semi-anti-hero that James Robinson obviously brought up quite a bit for his Starman series. I love this book. I think it was great. I knew shit about the Shade in 2011 when I was reading it. I just thought it looked kind of interesting, and I fell in love with it. And made me want to go back and read Starman to just kind of see how he developed this character. Talking about artists, you're talking about amazing artists for this. Cully Hamner starts out. It's a 12-issue maxi series, so you've got 12 issues and you're done. It's a very quick read, very cool. It plays with history, plays with legacy, all the things that were explored a little bit in, not so much with Shade, but obviously a lot more with Starman. But from his perspective. And so you get the characters from Starman, you get the O'Dares, Mikal makes an appearance as well. But you've also got amazing artists. You've got Cully Hamner, you've got Javier Pulido, you've got Jill Thompson, Fraser Irving, Gene Ha, and of course a beautiful issue number 4, done by Darwin Cook. And it's a 1940s episode. It's The Shade. And it's a glorious book. It's hilarious in great parts. It's mind-blowing in others, and just is a wonderful romp through history. It's very dense read, though, so just be aware there's a lot of dialogue and a lot of dialogue boxes for Shade.
The
But
last
it's
two
great.
issues will take you forever to.
Oh yeah,
Oh my god, it's like From Hell. You
yeah.
know, like From Hell takes you. It's that level.
It's like
Yeah.
they took it as Robinson took it as a challenge. I've only got 12 issues to do this. Well, I'm going to use every page. But it's great, so much fun.
One thing I also loved in the 4th issue is you get some time dedicated to a DC character named Madame Fatal, and
Yes.
Madame Fatal is a cross-dressing character.
Yes.
I don't think we ever established. It's basically a story of a male who disguised himself as a female in the 40s to fight crime. The arc specifically deals with his daughter, but it's interesting that that's a character that was inherited from Quality Comics, but in Robinson's hands, man, that's a hefty story.
Well, I just I thought it was great. The whole thing, all the characters that he pulls in, the children of the Shade, his family, however he defines it. It truly makes it a great international book. He goes from Opal City to Australia to Spain to France to not that order, and then of course ends up in basically the DC version of the Heliopic Brotherhood of Ra from the Mike Mignola verse. So, great book. I recommend it. It's a lot of fun, and you don't have to know anything about the Shade or Starman to get a lot of that. A lot of that story told to you. So hopefully it'll inspire you to go back and read those. But
okay, Brian, how about you? You have a second?
I do actually, and I did an Audible. I was gonna do Multiversity, but I'm like, nah, there's so much. So Wednesday Comics, I have these somewhere. I don't want to do the thing. I had these in paper. When so I should talk about this. So this is an anthology book. It came out on newsprint every Wednesday, which is comic release day, or at least it used to be. And it would have all of these different adventures presented in a very funny pages sort of style that you'd find in a newspaper. And every talent that was not a household name, some I think were at that point, but lots of just really interesting pairings of writers and artists did work on this, and I'll go through a couple of those here in a second. But they came out on paper in newsprint, and I had them. I collected all of them. And when I sold my collection before I moved, I parted with them as well, which I'm sort of bummed about. But
they were impossible to fold back together, though.
Yeah, no, any collector would have been whatever.
Oh my god,
I thought about making an art piece out of it, you taking it in decoupage or whatever. I don't know.
They were impossible.
Didn't do it. Doesn't matter. Yeah. But this hardcover that they did, which I love because they were oversized. They were the form was very large. Preserves that in this giant hardcover, which is gorgeous. And I mean, this I'll put this up on the camera and try not to not speak over the mic here, but all of these characters are featured. From what I remember, because I haven't revisited this in a while, I think my favorite was the Dead Man series, which was I think Jay Bone. Where is it? Maybe it's not Jay Bone. I'll figure out who does that. Bullock and Huck. See, I gotta look up who those artists are. Yeah, Dave Bullock and Vinton Huck. Lettered by Fletcher and edit color by Dave Stewart, of course. That Dead Man, I don't love Dead Man. A lot of the stuff is just okay. Great series with him in this. The Superman, I don't remember loving the Superman story. I think it's the art by Lee Bermejo. It's just not my style, but it's a good story, I think. John Arcudi has been the writer for that. The Commandi series by Dave Gibbons and art by Ryan Sook, also fantastic. The Batman by Azzarello and Eduardo Riso, beautiful, just gorgeous. Flash. Oh, the Flash series is fantastic. It's very Silver Age, very classic Flash by Carl Kerschel and Brendan Fletcher. So and there's a Wonder Woman story in here. That's some of the Wonder Woman story is probably the most unique art style. I mean, it's not as unique now
Mhm.
But at that point, it was very different. It's funny. It actually reminds me of the whole little Tempest in a Teapot about that variant cover for Wonder Woman 1984. We haven't talked about this in any kind of sense, but and it's not worth talking about. But I like seeing Wonder Woman in a not standard or non-standard bombshell format. Not that I don't mind; she's fine in that too. But I actually really enjoy those like different explorations of her design, like Darwin Cook's from New Frontier. Perfect. Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, I don't know that we didn't pick that, and I don't know that
No.
would be another fantastic choice, and I have it on the thing. But yeah, Wednesday
Watchmen,
Comics.
The Dark Knight Returns, Batman Year One. There's a lot we didn't talk.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
But no, Wednesday Comics. If you haven't, if you totally missed it, I would say, if you can find this and it's a good price, grab it. It's great. It's a great conversation piece too if you have it out on your coffee table, what have you. But if you want to just read it digitally, oh, there it is. That Wonder Woman is so perfect. I love Darwin Cook's like very golden age Wonder Woman. It's
that sentence was over after Cook. You just love Darwin Cook.
You're right. No, of course. But anyway,
Well,
yeah, Wednesday Comics. Did you guys collect this when it came out?
Oh yeah. And like I said, I struggled with the folding. You had to. Oh, it was a nightmare, and no bags fit it. It was just weird. So it was very welcome to have that book. Also, with the book, I forget what the features were because I'm working on material, but there were stories that were prepared in case somebody was late because it was a weekly book, and those which were never printed because everybody was on time. Those are printed within the hardcover. So I forget what feature. Maybe the Creeper. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, I just found it.
Yeah.
Yep. Hawkman. There's Kyle Baker Hawkman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, it's definitely worth seeking out. For a long time, you could find that discounted pretty well. I don't think the hardcover sold that well. So if you can find it, grab it.
It's $50 retail. So I mean, if you get it,
you'll find that much cheaper. Yeah.
It's just a beautiful book. Like that's the thing. As much as I don't like buying trades anymore. Because I'm all digital, whatever. Oh, and yeah, Ben Caldwell for the Youthful Wonder Woman. That's the artist. Thank you, James. This is just a beautiful book. It's not an absolute exactly, and it does frustrate people who want to put it on their shelf. This is why I'm suggesting it more as a coffee table book. But it's just so beautiful, and I love it. I love it.
Okay, Caleb, what's your second there?
So my second, just real quick, you remember earlier how you said that there are some people who think that Karen Berger can't edit superhero stories?
Yeah.
Well, they can shut the fuck up because she edited what is the book that made me fall in love with my favorite DC character. And that book is, and this is, you're not going to be able to tell what it is just from the cover, but because I don't like dust covers. But she edited George Perez's Wonder Woman. Which is the book that made me fall in love with Wonder Woman. And Wonder Woman is my favorite character at DC. So this story, just for those of you who don't know, was originally supposed to be written by the great Len Wein and drawn by George Perez, but there were some issues with the story, the way they wanted to go. And they just inevitably decided all around, even Len decided that it would be best if George just told his story. And so it was written and drawn by George. George Perez is my favorite comic artist of all time. Like I know that's like that we say that and we're all prone to hyperbole, but he's certainly the comic artist that made me fall in love with comic art. He's the first comic artist I noticed as far as like putting a name to art. And he's, to this date, I've met a lot of comic artists, and no disrespect to any of those fine people that I've met, but he's the comic artist I've been the most excited to meet. The one that I felt like a stupid kid stumbling over my words when I met him. This book is so unbelievably special for what it did to the character, for what it did for George Perez, for what it allowed him to express and to put onto the paper. It changed the history of Wonder Woman. It changed the way that her story was told. It brought something new to the zeitgeist, to the character. It made me fall in love with Cheetah. It made me want to know more about her torrid and weird relationship with Hercules. The first thing that happens is she comes face to face with Ares, not only as a villain, but as a concept. and I think the conceptual understanding of war that she is fighting is one of the most important aspects of this book. And I like you can get meta as hell with this if you want to. You don't necessarily have to though. It runs on two different levels, and that's the magic of George Perez. And again, edited by Karen Berger, so rock and roll. The best Wonder Woman. Just I love everybody who writes Wonder Woman on some level, but the best Wonder Woman, and it's George Perez.
Okay. If you notice, the writing credits on the first two issues are not Len Wein.
No.
Can you hang on a second? 1 second. Wedded bliss. All right.
I'll jump in and agree. It's great.
Okay. So if you notice on the first two issues, the writer is a gentleman named Greg Potter. Greg Potter wrote the Gem Son of Saturn series and the first two issues of Wonder Woman. It's a shame he didn't write more for DC. Had a couple of Warren issues, but not a lot of comic book output, I should say. And then Ween takes over. But as you said, Caleb, George was ready to write at that point. You know, it was well beyond co-plotting.
I keep a bookmark on this page. This is my favorite page in the whole story, and that's saying something.
Can you quickly go to the page where you first see Steve Trevor's mother? Because I think that is one of my favorite pages of all time. If I could own it, naturally, when it comes to a George Perez page, it would be the cover of Crisis number 7 or JLA Avengers number 4. You know, there's so many iconic things, but this is a pretty good page if he does get to it. So I'm going to talk about. Oh, I got a prop too here. So. Anyway, so when we were talking about this episode, you know, again, I had come down with this edict about a full arc, and when I was first reading comic books in the Bronze Age, because I'm old as sand, you didn't have a lot of the extended arcs in the way that you do in DC. Marvel certainly had more, but DC you didn't have too much. The first extended arc with Batman was probably the Ra's al Ghul. And there's various collections that have that book around. This is one of them, the Tales of the Demon. But the book I want to talk about is the second extended arc that I read, which was contemporaneous with what I was reading. The first one is a book about the murder of Batman and the trial, and it's pretty awful. But when you had Steve Englehart take over for Detective Comics, first with Walt Simonson, but very quickly with the much missed past before his time Marshall Rogers. The Batman stories, which has been collected as Strange Apparitions, and never was called Strange Apparitions when the books came out. For me, that was where Batman Year One was. You could have that, or Dark Knight Return. You know, this set the stage for that, of being a very adult, very strong Batman story with consequences. There are political machinations in Gotham City that Batman has to maneuver around. At the same time, a long lost love of his, Silver St. Cloud, comes into town, and it's at the same time a strong Batman story as well as a very strong Bruce Wayne story. There's this remarkable moment here where, oh, please let me find it quick, where Silver St. Cloud puts it together who Batman is, and you just see that, you know, her saying it's Bruce, it's all told between the eyes of the two characters. You know, this is 1976, okay? 1976, 1977. When we talk about great pages, this, I think, is one of the most amazing pages ever of Batman leaving the roof. There, that's Marshall Rogers. You have the first appearance in 27 years of Deadshot. was basically a one-off character, and look what's happened to that character since that time. You have a really interesting reinterpretation of Clayface. This basically reestablished Hugo Strange as a major Batman villain, and at its core, it's a really damn good story and a wonderful Batman and Robin scene too, because Robin's clearly getting older, and this is a Bronze Age book that kind of reads like a post-Bronze Age book, and that's one I would recommend.
Awesome.
Okay. And that's probably the one that none of you folks have read, right? Okay. You might want to think about
Batman
it.
in the 70s?
Yeah, you might want to think about it. It's a really good story. Brian, do we have any other comments from people there before we start with the Wolves?
I am so glad you asked. So let's see. We have back to this. Well, I thought we mentioned that one. Yep, that was the one about Michael. Ben Caldwell also really enjoyed Wonder Woman. I'm sorry, James also enjoyed Wonder Woman, specifically the Ben Caldwell art that we mentioned. And Kayla's so right about Perez's Wonder Woman. That's all of the comments. I know there have been others randomly here and there. Kristen, has been giving us some good stuff, but it's all up on if you go on our Facebook and you look for the video, all the chats are up there too. So
all right. Well, we're going to wrap this one up. Gentlemen, thank you for your choices, and especially after this week of internet nonsense. This was something that I personally really needed. Again, we're going to weather the storm. There may be a retraction of monthly titles. There may be some changes to the way DC conducts itself in the marketplace that we're not prepared for. But 10 years from now, there's going to be a DC Comics, so don't worry, folks. And if they have input that is of the quality of some of the books that we've talked about tonight, we're all good. All right, so when we wrap an episode of the Comic Book Bears Up, we do so with a segment we call the Woofs of the Week, which is where we signify something, which it could be a comic book or it might be a film or a charitable initiative or a TV program, anything under the sun that we think you, fair listener or viewer, may be interested in sampling. I'll start as always with Steve. Steve, what is your Woof of the Week?
I'm dodging a moth that somehow got into the room, so if you see something hitting me in the head, that's the moth that's flying around.
You're channeling Mothra, aren't you? Doing a little Polynesian dance.
Yeah. Anyway, another quick shout out to the season finale of Stargirl this past week.
Yes.
Absolutely incredible. It's wonderful. I'm not going to say too much about it because I don't want to spoil anything. But like Jeff Johns has said, if you have a chance to watch it, there are no Easter eggs. Everything is in play. So if they introduce something, it will be seen in the series. It's not just funny.
I just have to say that was like a really good Jeff Johns comic come to life.
Yes,
it was
exactly.
Oh my god, it was so good.
So but my actual Woof of the Week is a little zine / comic called Yes, I'm Flagging. A quick, tiny, completely not comprehensive guide to queer flagging, and specifically queer flagging, not necessarily gay flagging, gay men's flagging, because of course there is lesbian flagging, there's femme flagging, which is done with nails, and then things have kind of changed a little bit, through obviously a lot more visible non-binary and trans flagging as well, and this is actually done by Archie. Let's see if you have it, Archie Bongiovanni. And Archie Bongiovanni, they are a creator who has done the comic series Greasebats, but they also did a very similar book called The Quick and Easy Guide to They, Them Pronouns. So Archie themselves is non-binary or is genderqueer, and decided to put something out that also looks at flagging. So flagging, of course, mostly it's a sexual thing, but also is a way of sort of expressing identity, enjoyment, things that you like. And so if you aren't familiar with gay flagging, it's the use of a hanky or the hanky code in either the left or right back pocket to signify whether you like to do something or like to have something done to you. And it's a various different types of colors. intensity of the color, if there's checks, if there's no checks, blah, 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 all sorts of things. And again, this is not a comprehensive guide, but it will give you some interesting things. So if you like dark pink, you might like the tit torture. If you like yellow, why not get peed on? And this is just things that you can signify. And also they also have some other good, interesting tips on, how to use flagging, what it could signify. And at the very least, it's a conversation piece. If you see somebody flagging, or that somebody who might be flagging or doesn't, or maybe don't know that they're flagging because now they've got something in their back pocket that means something that maybe they're not sure they want to advertise. It's a conversation starter, so go up and talk to them. Although it's a little bit harder now, obviously, but when things open up a little bit more, or if you're able to socially distance while saying, "Hey, I noticed in your back pocket you've got a bright red on the left. Just curious, do you know what that means?" And have some fun with it.
Somebody should make masks that do that.
Well, essentially,
that's hard though, because between the flagging right or flagging left,
but you could do like a design that sort of, mimics
I guess
that.
one side.
You could just have like a big mask that says, "I really enjoy,"
or that.
Can I make a flagging suggestion? Save money. Just wear orange. Just use orange.
Yeah, it's the
kind of comprehensive.
It's the I'm good for anything.
Down for whatever.
Yep.
How do we know this?
I don't know. I've never used it.
Honestly,
I've never used it.
I've heard tell. All right, let's go over to Brian before we get ourselves in real trouble. Brian, what's your wolf of the week?
I just started watching Room 104, which is a HBO little shorts anthology series of sorts by the Duplass brothers. And my boyfriend Brandon had me watch it. And I had watched a previous episode that had like a woman who was dealing with a breakup and playing like synth, like electronic kind of music and ethereal, like, that vocal. Women with reverb is probably the genre name, or at least it should be. Anyway, great stuff. Every episode is unrelated to each other. It's just an anthology series. But the first one, and Bill, I don't know if you watched this. The first one is based on this idea that Bono, in an acceptance speech at the Grammys one year, referenced this artist who had only made like one album and then disappeared. So this group of kids, youngish people, like find this artist somehow and invite him to their hotel or to a hotel room. All of the episodes are shot in a motel like room 104, and he comes in and is this struggling artist, kind of obviously affected, and hijinks ensue. Let's just say that. But it's great, and what I found out later is the story is made up. It's completely contrived, based off of other kind of similar ideas and stuff. But one of the directors, who's also the writers, the two brothers who make the show, plays the artist who comes in and sings these songs that are actually really good, and from that period of like kind of pre-grunge sort of. It's great if you're a music fan, or if you just really like short storytelling through like TV anthology. It's highly recommended. Room 104. It's on HBO, HBO Max, whatever, however you find it, and it's great.
All right, awesome. Let's go over to Caleb. Caleb, what's your wolf of the week?
My wolf of the week goes out to a charitable initiative, but I want to piggyback. I know it got mentioned, and I was totally going to make this my wolf of the week, but New Frontier, it got mentioned, so it got some love, so I'm going to set it to the side. But one thing that this week did, and the purpose that we did this episode for, it showed us how quickly life can go from being very planned and very set out and very solid to very up in the air, and you can have everything that you need to exist in a modern life in this society ripped away from you in a single moment. Stories and the fears that a lot of comics people were telling online were a lot of the same stories and a lot of the same fears I hear from the people that I help out with the van, people who are experiencing homelessness here in Little Rock. So I felt like, if nothing else, this episode, the Wolf of the Week, was a good an important time to remind folks that they can go at any time and donate to the Hero Initiative. which is an organization that helps out comic creators who are in need because, again, comics don't have there's not exactly a retirement plan in comics, and there's not exactly benefits in comics. There's not a comics creators union or anybody who looks out for your well-being because most people are freelancers. So the Hero Initiative is a place that you can go and donate a little bit of money to, and they help out people in need, and they've helped out people like Carl Malone, like Mike Grell. They've helped out people like George Conway. You name it. It's a good charity. It's a good place to send your money to, and they're honest about what they do. Unlike, there's been some questions of other kind of well-known organizations that supposedly look out for the best interest of comics creators that maybe don't. I haven't heard anything about the Hero Initiative. The Hero Initiative does what they say they do. So, in honor or maybe in respect for people whose lives got turned upside down, go toss $10, go toss $15, go toss $5, go toss $1 to the Hero Initiative this week, because we need organizations like this and the people who make the things that we love, who don't get the kudos, who don't get the claps, who make the worlds that we love happen, need our help right now. So that's my wolf of the week.
Okay. My wolf of the week is connected with hating Caleb since last Wednesday. Caleb posted his list of 10 favorite guitarists, and since that time, I have been unable to come to a decision on 10 favorite guitarists. Or 10 best. I'm not sure how you characterized it. One thing I will say, though, and though he's not my number one, my number one is absolutely Adrian Belew. But I think any top 10 guitarist list that doesn't include Jimi Hendrix is faulty. And since that time, I revisited the Jimi Hendrix Experience catalog. Yeah, you're seeing this. It's only 3 discs through his time with the Experience, 1967 through 1969. They only had the time to release 3 albums, which Are You Experienced, Axis Bold as Love, and though you can't see that it's a double album in this format, Electric Ladyland. And there's still things he did that nobody else has been able to replicate or build upon. He was a genius, and it's always an interesting experience listening to genius at work. Might not necessarily be your thing, acid rock, or however you're going to characterize it, but I think if you do listen with open ears, the rewards are many. So that is my wolf of the week, the Jimi Hendrix Experience. All right. So we're what?
My list was faulty.
Yeah, it was faulty. Yeah. So is your list about grunge, but we can talk about that another time. So we're going to wrap this one up. Again, we are the Comic Book Bears podcast. You can find us on the Twitter and the Tumblr and the Instagram as Comic Book Bears. You can find us on the Facebook as Comic Book Bears podcast. Thank you for watching us through YouTube. Please make sure that you like our channel and provide comments so that we build a bit of a footprint on this platform. You can download our episodes through iTunes. Same thing. If you're enjoying the episode, please leave a review. You can also catch us through Stitcher Radio and some of the other podcatching platforms. And if you want to write to us, please do so by sending an email to comicbookbears@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Bill Zanowitz.
I'm Steve Morey.
I'm Brian.
And I'm
Pitter.
Caleb Alexander McKenzie.
You're going to hear a woof and an explosion. If you're listening, we'll be back next week. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Woof, bang.
Bang.